Welcome to today's Energy Central PowerSession entitled A Stepwise Journey Towards Digitalization and Grid Modernization. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to thank Schneider Electric for making today's event possible. Thanks very much to Schneider Electric. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to our moderator for today, David Wagman. David, welcome to the event. You have the floor.
Hi, PJ. Thanks very much and welcome to everybody. Again, I'm David Wagman and I will be your host and moderator for today's power session. This is going to be a really very interesting session today. We know that utilities face complex grid, power generation, and energy transition challenges as increasing numbers of distributed energy resources enter the mix. The emerging prosumer figures as a central part of these unprecedented industry challenges, increasing proliferation of DER, resiliency in the face of severe weather, wildfires, and cybersecurity threats, as well as significant load growth as electrification rapidly advances. The traditional script for utility enterprise projects often can be long, slow initiatives that deploy entire systems with high upfront costs. That kind of approach needs to change in response to today's hyper-dynamic operating environment. Agile deployment flips the script, if you will, by pursuing an accelerated path of incremental change with lower upfront costs. A stepwise approach typically is easier to initiate, often yields faster measurable results, and also can be future-proof. All of this, in turn, enables utilities to start small and scale up over time by focusing first on the most pressing customer needs and highest priority use cases. This power session today, I'm happy to say, offers insight into how a stepwise approach can be an effective strategy to accelerate the energy transition and optimally manage DER. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to begin by introducing each of our panel members and invite them to spend just a couple of minutes to tell us about their company and its interest in today's topic. We'll start with Scott Kohler, who's Vice President of Global Strategy, Innovation, and Marketing, Digital Grid Solutions at Schneider Electric. Scott, take a moment and tell us more about yourself and Schneider Electric.
Yeah, thanks, David, and thanks to everyone that's here with us today and all those that are dialed in and showing up. Well, I guess overall, just from a perspective of Schneider Electric, I mean, our overall mission is to be a digital partner. And we think about sustainability, flexibility, resilience, and that really goes across everything. So I think the good part, and our focus today is really around power and grid. And for me, my focus is on innovation and business development in this specific segment. But it does align really well with the broader things that Schneider Electric does all around energy management. And I think the other aspect too is there's so many challenges that we see in our industry, and there's so much change. And the idea of being innovative and having a culture of innovation, how all of us are doing that more and more and looking to do that more, our customers, vendors, and how we collaborate and partner together is so important. And that's really where my focus is, and I think a part of this discussion will be.
Great, thanks very much, Scott. Next up is Michael Kelly, who's Principal Research Analyst with Guidehouse Insight. Michael, can you take a minute and tell us more about yourself and Guidehouse?
Yeah, thanks. So Michael Kelly, Associate Director and Principal Research Analyst here with Guidehouse Insights. And so we're a market research firm focused primarily on the clean technology space. So covering anything from the energy software platforms that we'll discuss today to smart buildings, connected renewables, DER management. And I manage what's known as our Grid Edge Digital Solutions research service. And that covers more or less the gambit of energy and utility software platforms. So everything from your costly and complex enterprise IT/OT systems through to customer grid analytics, cloud, SaaS, really that whole software side of the coin as it pertains to electric utilities. So very much looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Next, we're going to turn to Adam Harrison, who's IT Manager at Puget Sound Energy. Adam, could you take a minute and add a bit more detail about yourself and the utility?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. I'm Adam Harrison, Manager for Distribution Management Systems at Puget Sound Energy. So that's a gas and electric utility in the Pacific Northwest, covering most of Western Washington. Historically, distribution management systems has been an outage management application, and we have had to undergo a very significant change, not just from engaging with distribution SCADA, but more along load flow analysis, fault VAR optimization, things like that. Virtual power plants, DERs are coming in. There are significant demands on GIS. The protection groups are having challenges. The planning groups are having challenges. We are facing a path forward that nobody is necessarily thoroughly experienced in, and it is a collaborative effort. So though I'm an IT manager, I am a partner to many of those business groups that I've already mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. I'm also pleased to have as a panel member Dr. Andrea Nusser, who's Director of Customer Strategy and Experience at Hydro One. Andrea, take a moment and tell us more about yourself and your role at Hydro One.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you everybody for dialing in today, and welcome to the webinar. Yeah, my name is Andrea Nusser. I work from the customer side, but in a group that we call Energy Transition. So really my task is to bring the customer and the grid together and figure out how they can intricately work together to unlock the maximum value for the grid, make the grid more efficient, and also deliver additional customer value. Because as everybody else has already mentioned, we are at the cusp of a big change, and we need to change how we do business. And our customers can really provide a lot of value. So that's what I'm trying to bring to the table at Hydro One, and as well to this conversation today.
Thank you, Andrea. And thanks to everybody to the panel. This is going to be a really good discussion today. I will tell our live audience today that we are going to be accepting questions from you. So as we go along, if you have something that you would like our panel to address, feel free to send in that question and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I want to start, panel, if we could, at kind of a high level and talk about some of the underlying macro forces that are underway in the utility space today. And I think that a lot of these will be familiar to our audience. Certainly things related to the proliferation of DER, some of the regulatory reforms that are underway. There are things related to government funding through the Inflation Reduction Act. There's the broader push to try to electrify greater portions of the economy, including transportation and home heating, those sorts of things. I wonder if each of you, and Scott, let me start with you. I wonder if you could put some additional context and thinking around the big macro forces that are at work. That come into play as we talk about this transition.
Yeah, David, I love to start with that, and thanks for giving an overview. You nailed many of the big macro challenges that we have, and as you were describing them, I actually was thinking more of a sort of a voice of customer response, I guess, and so maybe this will encapsulate more specifically what we're seeing in industry and a lot of our customers are challenged with. And I'll give you an example. So growing customer connection requests. So this could be service connections, interconnections, so it could be load or large load. It could also be generation, things that are going to export energy onto the grid. And I think I bring that one up as an example because we see more and more of our customers having that queue be extended. And I think partly because the demands are of the grid operating differently, which means how do utilities best assess these things? How can they understand the impact? How can they plan around that? How can they determine whether there's going to be a constraint caused by these things or not? So there's an aspect of this that's challenging. And another way to maybe think of it is, how do we maximize the capacity of the grid? So, leverage existing infrastructure to do a lot of new things and allow and enable more this energy transition. And I think another aspect too is some things that come up are the aspects that utilities have tried maybe different things and they're on somewhere along a journey, and there's been discussions about scaling pilots and, well, we tried this, but how does it all really come together What are the next things we can do? And I think that really comes to even the theme of this discussion today about collaborating differently and looking at journeys and mapping things out. A big focus too is certainly total cost of ownership. The idea that there's so much change and so much need and so much new things that need to be done, but yet a constrained budget. And the revenue stream is changing for utilities too. So you think all that at once, obviously there's a challenge. And I think encapsulating it really is, I think when you look at these various aspects, what I think we're seeing and we're hearing a lot more is that our utility customers, those that are operating infrastructure for society, are needing and wanting more technology partnerships, meaning leaders that they can really collaborate with. And I think that's partly because technology is changing so fast. There's a lot of things that are available today, but not necessarily been implemented. And so some of this too is how do we unlock the value we could get in different ways? And I think that means a different kind of relationship. And I think all of those are kind of what we're hearing from our customers.
Good stuff. And Michael Kelly, I want to ask you, bring you into the conversation because you led some analysis at the end of last year, taking a look at some of the mega trends involving IT and some of the things that came out. And I'm hoping that you can unpack these a little bit for us. Are topics related to architectural transformations, pricing and deployment models, streamlined upgrades, frameworks, mobility, cloud enablement. Maybe you could talk a little bit about each of those and how those come into play in this discussion as mega trends that really are driving things in the industry at present.
Yeah, and happy to. And I think, just to build off Scott's point, I think, that most heavily marketed macro trend or message is naturally the influx of renewables, behind the meter DERs. And I think a lot of times there's an underappreciation of how far reaching some of those implications are, right? Some utilities might say, all right, well, let's get ourselves a DERMS and we've fixed the problem. It's not that simple in most terms, but you think about the enterprise IT space, you have to kind of model and manage those DERs within a GIS system. You need to automatically build new rate structures that are tied to DSM programs or EV programs. Naturally, as we look in the OT space, driving up demand for ADMS and more kind of complex mission control systems. And then there's the plethora of DER analytics, from detecting where EVs are to actually standing up some of these more complex DSM programs. And a lot of that, or a lot of those impending challenges, I would say primarily relate to scalability and elasticity of the software platforms, again, whether it's enterprise IT or third-tier analytics, to manage this influx and this new changing paradigm. So when we think about some of the architectural transformations common across the energy software space, Scott's very familiar. When we look at, building upon modular platforms, which was, the architectural innovation of 10 years ago, we'll say, with things like containerized microservices, service-oriented architectures, the use of open source software, even in the OT space. And like I said, many of these evolutions are being framed under the banner of greater scalability and elasticity. I'd say the other big one in terms of architectural transformation is facilitating more seamless integrations between different software platforms. And again, this is, I think, a point that's well understood within the utility industry now, is that the idea of utility silos, that needs to be eroded, right? And so whether it be your ADMS providers, DERMS providers, or some of the more innovative analytics providers, you see a push towards facilitating some of those more seamless upgrades under the banner of complexity and reducing costs. And then the other point you mentioned in terms of pricing model transformations, this is one that I find kind of personally exciting, because forever, the traditional pricing model has been $2 per meter all the way up, maybe a volume discount when you get to 1 million meters. But what we've seen, and this is being driven a lot by utility and customer sentiment, is the need for more value-driven pricing models. Usage or volumetric-based pricing models, right? Frameworks that align more with utility-specific needs. And again, it's, I would say, a slow evolution, but you see as utilities become more comfortable and aware of how cloud computing arrangements are structured, right, in terms of those usage-based data storage contracts, more shift towards more acceptance for non-traditional pricing models. And I think that's going to be something you'll see really kick into high gear over the course of this year and beyond.
Good stuff. Lots to unpack there. Very good. Thank you. Andre and Adam, I want to turn to you because you certainly represent the front line. You're in the trenches with the utilities. And I wonder, let's start with Andrea. If you could tell us what your reality is. What are you seeing and what are the main drivers that are affecting your day-to-day work and view of all of this?
Well, we definitely see that our customers' expectations are changing. And it starts with just some basic service expectations. When you think about digitalization, it has progressed so fast in so many other sectors. And customers have come to become customized to excellent service by so many other service providers. So utilities can no longer take the stance of, oh, we are just a utility and maybe we have a monopoly and we don't have to compete. No, we need to still compete with these expectations. So at a basic level, we need to make our customer service and how we deal with our customers a much smoother journey and a much smoother experience. And on top of that, customers expect us to know them and to really meet their needs and understand their needs. And that goes hand in hand with really understanding much more what our customers do today and what they're planning to do in the future. So we are investing a lot more in trying to figure out how do we engage our customers and learn more from what they are planning to do, both in order to help them better connect to the grid, but also to make sure that we build the right grid, that we right size it, and that we invest in areas where customers need it first and need it most. So in that sense, it's a very exciting time right now where some of the more traditional customer service platforms, for example, now really need to be interlinked with more grid systems to provide this 360 view of the customer and bring that information back to planning and operation to really build a wholesome system and structure.
And Andre, I want to ask one other question because a real advantage of having you on the panel today is that you're a Canadian representing a Canadian an Ontario utility. I'm wondering if there are any differences or if there are any particular drivers that are affecting Hydro One that we would not see, say, with a US-based utility. Any great differences, or is it sort of, this is the same challenges across North America?
I would say we probably deal with a lot of the same challenges. We have a really, PJ, I don't know, you might want to bring up my slide number 1. I think it's a good overview of Hydro One's service territory. So it shows you a little bit how unique Hydro One is. So Hydro One is the largest electricity transmission and distribution provider in Ontario. And Ontario is huge. It's geographically, it's the size of California and Texas combined. So we serve all of the transmission, all of our service territory is Ontario on the transmission side. And on the distribution side, we serve about 75% of the territory, but only 25% of the customers. So that makes our service territory kind of unique. So it's very sparse. Most of our customers are rural customers. And just to give you a sense, we have more wooden poles than customers. So 1.4 million customers, 1.5 million wooden poles. So that comes with its own challenges, but I think in some ways we are quite similar to some more rural American or US utilities. On the other hand, we certainly don't have the influx of money that's coming from the IRA right now. The Canadian government at the federal level is very much focused on a net zero 2050 plan, but they haven't quite released the same types of funds. So in that sense, we're dealing, I think, with the same goals and same issues, but we don't have a lot of funding available, even though it's getting better. Some of the federal funding agencies are putting more money into grid modernization projects, but we're still lagging behind a bit.
Good, excellent. Thank you for the context. It's very helpful. Adam, let me ask you to talk a little bit about your day-to-day and the pressures that you see and the changes that are underway affecting your workflow.
Yeah, thank you. I think that all of our utilities, and we would recognize this, are undergoing some very significant changes. As I mentioned, a lot of a lot of the work that we're doing is net new, not necessarily well understood by the utility industry. Prosumers, we are now in an area where we are looking to our customer group as also our partners, rather than just a meter that consumes electricity. There is now a person behind that meter. They have a persona. They have an extent to which they will engage in projects and programs, and we need to understand those so we can appropriately communicate with those customer groups. There's also a significant effort within our companies, which typically have an if not now, then when philosophy that blocks us from trying to move faster. So effectively, what I'm saying there is you have a project, you have to do everything within that project because you'll never get any money again. And that is a culture change that we have to shift away from if we're going to try and deliver things more quickly. And then there's another aspect to this, which is we have to lean into our partners. So that's our vendors like Schneider, but it's also other vendors such as the Googles of the world who have skill sets in particular areas like artificial intelligence that we just don't necessarily have within the utility industries. And so we have to now be thinking of, we're no longer a monopoly. We are partnered with a group of vendors who are achieving their goals. We're looking into artificial intelligence and leaning into those skill sets. And it's becoming a research-oriented environment rather than a project delivery, multi-year timeline sort of delivery. It has to be targeted more towards research. And we'll talk about pilots and other things along the nature of that. I think from an IT perspective, I would say it is significantly changing the landscape as well. And the biggest change here comes from IT needs to walk in the shoes of our business partners. It isn't wait for the business group to come to us with an idea and then we can engage on how we might solve that. We have to be building out the roadmap alongside our customer group, really understanding their challenges and building those multi-year programs. And I can talk to another slide on all of the different projects that we've got, but that's kind of the short version of it, which is it's fundamentally a different world.
Yeah. Well, and let's bring up that slide in just another moment. What I wanted to do is shift just a little bit, because this is an excellent overview of what the broad market complexities are. And what I'm hoping that we can do next is invite Scott to talk a bit about what a stepwise approach means, how it's different than a pilot, and talk a bit about some of the flexibility, the requirements for flexibility in a fast-changing business environment. So Scott, could you talk in a little bit more detail about what is meant by stepwise?
Yeah, thank you. And hopefully I do a good job of pointing back to some of the comments because those are all very good and quite apropos. I'll say a phrase, and I'll use the phrase "flip the script," and I think that encapsulates some, Adam, Andrea, what you guys are saying about doing things differently, whether it's a technical, business, customer, IT, whatever that perspective is. It is a change, and therefore, what does that change look like, and what's the need? And I think one aspect of it is, I think, Adam, you mentioned projects. I think the idea of going out to market for a massive platform that you're looking to have every single requirement and everything understood, what your 10-year journey is going to be, and what you want, and then go out and pick that magical vendor that's going to give you everything you want with this great technology, and that'll solve the problem. It's just, I'm oversimplifying, and that is a bit of the past, and then there's different financial reasons why that may be done. But the idea of, when you start thinking about, there is so much change, technology is evolving, the needs are evolving, the way that utilities operate will change. It's really impossible and probably not very appropriate to try to predict what that will be many years on the road. So the next thing, okay, so what's another approach? And the idea of starting small is huge. And I think I'll just name some concepts to give you some examples. So, being more agile, allowing for changes, engaging as partners, not focusing on just a large list of requirements, I think is what I would try to encapsulate here. One thing to think about is, I think pilot type projects, because I want to think about small, but I want to think that something that's a little different, or maybe not what we would consider to be traditionally a pilot. And one aspect I think that's kind of fun is the whole concept of even rebranding a pilot. So if you're going to start a project that is new or is innovation, but you're trying to solve some near-term challenges as well, best position yourself for the future, then I think there's a few things of why a different approach could be done, and even call it something different. We've used concept, we've used minimum viable product, things that even just in the mindset of everyone that's involved thinks about this differently. And three key things I'll try to limit it to that's different would be, one, involving a broader set of people. So we already talked about the impact on utilities affecting many things they have, and how do you get different stakeholders involved in engagement? Not just a small or siloed team that might be doing something really interesting, but how does the broader scope at least engage at some level? And they're giving input, they're helping prioritize the use. Another is to think about it as so you can start small, but you can think about lots of different ways you could scale this over time. So maybe you do focus on a couple of use cases. Maybe you give yourself a 1-year horizon to starting point. But what foundational means that if this is successful, we learn and we work to scale. What does that look like? So you're not in a rip and replace situation, or okay, that was interesting, now what? But yet at the same time, it still gives you a flexibility. You can pivot, you can adjust, and I think that's really key. And I think another aspect of that agility aspect is that you can be doing things with a team that's as you're going along versus the vendor developing something or preparing something and saying, here it is. The teamwork is involved in that whole process. And then I think lastly, the third thing that we did for maybe what we think of as pilots is near-term value. So you can also get near-term value. It doesn't have to be just an experiment or a science project. You can define success, and you can potentially in the near term. And so I think those are three key things to think about. And maybe as we have discussions here, we can talk about examples of technology, other things that help this and enable this, and things that we're doing to try to help.
Yeah, and I just wanted to just to point out, just building on Scott's kind of points there. I think a lot of when we think about kind of full-fledged enterprise deployment versus a more pilot or stepwise approach, I think a lot of it comes down to risk, both reputational and financial. When I speak with utilities, a lot of times I'll ask, what are the primary pain points or best practices that you experience as part of your deployments? And I'd say some of the most common responses are around, well, one, just scope clarity during the RFP process, lack of sufficient training prior to deployment, and then following deployment, data quality. All of these issues or challenges are compounded. If you're deploying a full-fledged ADMS plus a DERMS, right, rather than maybe just a DMS or an OMS under a stepwise approach. So I think a lot of these issues and like I said, pain points that utilities are experiencing are only compounded when you try and leapfrog a pilot or stepwise approach with something a little bit more complex.
PJ, I wonder if you could bring up the first slide of Adam's, and Adam, maybe you could take a moment and just talk about it. And I'll tell the audience that there's a lot of complexity in there, but I think that that's good because it struck me when I saw this as an interesting example of the stepwise idea that we don't see a lot of pilot projects. There's not pilot projects in it. These are business critical projects that need to be undertaken one by one, but lead up to kind of a broad a broad objectives. And I wonder, Adam, if you could talk a bit, maybe Scott offer a little commentary, and then Andrea also, if this kind of reflects sort of what your reality is as well. But Adam, maybe you could begin and talk a bit about what we're looking at here.
Sure, thank you. I'm certainly not going to go through all of the items on this slide. That is not the intention at all. But what I do want to say, first off, PSE 2030 is really an acronym for clean energy. We are mandated regulatory perspective to achieve clean energy, but also it's what's valuable to our company. And I would say most of all, it's actually what our customer group wants us to achieve. And so PSE 2030 is about clean energy. When we started this, I think back in 2020, we started to look at all of the different possibilities of conversations that were ongoing and things that might happen around electrification, but not necessarily understanding what does that roadmap look like for the next decade. That was extremely difficult to predict. And so we put together a series of, and this is all of the items in here, of things that are related to clean energy or to grid modernization, and then the overlap between the two. And when we finalized that list, which is what this is, it was a shocker. It was a real shocker. How can we possibly achieve all of these things within the course of a decade? And then what the impact to the IT industry was, is that large red circle where we had to be engaged in all of these things. It was clear then, as I said, IT needs to partner our business groups and understand where these are going, but also we can't possibly achieve all of these on a full extent. We need to understand which ones are valuable, which ones aren't, and adjust and evolve to that over the course of the decade. So we picked out a few, like I would say, ADMS was an early adoption there to try and put in an ADMS system so that we can move past outage management and towards load flow, volt var optimization, and FLISR. But we're doing pilots for those in the sense of, let's take 5 substations, see what it takes to implement that, see what the implications are on the data, and what value we can actually achieve from that, so we can better then estimate what will it take to expand that out to the rest of our substations. So the goal is obviously to expand it out, but we may discover that some areas of what we're trying to achieve on, it isn't financially beneficial to do that. And so you've got to really try and take these into smaller pieces. Time varying rates is another example of, let's try and understand how can we engage with customers to make this of interest to them. If we try and did a large scale project where we were reaching out to all of our customers, we recognized we don't have that sales skill set. We really need to adopt and learn to that experience. The virtual power plant is another example of trying to engage with an islanded community. We have a lot of those island areas in the Pacific Northwest, and really trying to understand how can we assist them in a large outage scenario with batteries, as well as a virtual power plant in which we can engage with them along the lines of, please turn down your thermostats. How do we communicate with our customers? Is it text message? Is it emails? And that comes back to that understanding the personas of our customers and how they can best be integrated into what we're all trying to achieve. Some of the things that I would say then around pilots is really don't try to take on everything. Minimum viable product also means out of the box and best practices. If you need to try and improve something into the future, well, do that in the future. Right now, you're trying to get something going, so just take whatever the vendor is that you've chosen, work with them. If there's something that you absolutely have to do, then work with the vendors to achieve that. Try and get that back into the main product line, but really avoid that, because speed to market is significantly governed by customizations and specialty processes that we build into our business organizations. I think a lot of the financial strength as well comes from understanding just how much value can you get out of something, and being able to say, that was good, we enjoyed that experience, it was valuable to that particular community, but maybe it doesn't make sense for a larger audience. So, you know, as we were looking at a virtual power plant, we were also asking ourselves, how might this fit into gas reductions? So if we've got an area where it's particularly susceptible to low pressure gas, then maybe we could engage with that customer group to say, could you turn down your gas thermostats? And we experimented with that, but we discovered that the software wasn't necessarily appropriate. And so we've readjusted, right? Rather than continuing on, you know, a multi-million-dollar project of some sort, we're able to stop and adjust ourselves. So there's a large area of work involved in here, and we kind of have to be able to adapt much more quickly. I'm happy to talk about other ways in which we've done that. But.
And Andre, let me ask you. I imagine you've got a similar slide with equally detailed. I wonder if you could talk about what resonates as you look at this and hearing what Adam has been talking about. What similarities do you see, and what additional insights can you offer?
Yeah, no, I can absolutely relate to all these complexities. And I think it shows, again, first of all, how much work we all need to do, how much is riding on an IT infrastructure and really a new way of thinking about all of the different systems that we need to implement. And then also, how do we make sure that we take into account the complexity but don't get lost in all of the details? So how do we take out small pieces of this and try certain things out? And to Scott's earlier point, I'm trying to ban the word pilot from our vocabulary, because I feel words like proof of concept or something make a lot more sense, where you see the bigger vision and you try something out small, but you try it with a clear goal in mind, and always thinking, okay, what are my hypotheses? I'm testing them. What will make me move forward and what will make me stop, rather than just going and trying something. So I can absolutely relate to that. And since the slide is up here right now, maybe I can talk about one particular way in which we have trialed some of to get through some of the complexity with a specific program. So Adam talked about virtual power plant and engaging customers and really figuring out how to bring customers into the mix. So we were faced with the same issues. Our regulator wants us to connect more DERs and engage more customers. We know we anticipate a lot of load growth, and we need to figure out non-wires alternatives, which is also a regulatory pressure that we're facing. So instead of just looking at poles and wire solutions to meet our customers' capacity needs, how do we rely on technology and on different, more flexible solutions? So from the customer viewpoint, we wanted to make sure that we allow customers to participate without making a big upfront investment. So we launched a demand response program. We started off with smart thermostats. It was a pretty simple program. Customers would enroll their device if they had one already. If they didn't have one, they could buy one from our marketplace. They would get a $75 off-bill gift card from us, and we would take over control of their thermostats when it was really hot. We have since expanded the program to also include EVs and EV chargers, as well as baseboard smart thermostats. And it's been a really amazing learning journey, because we looked at exactly those points that Adam mentioned before. Which are the right channels to engage our customers? How do we need to speak to them? And then we ran about 80 events with them to test, are we actually building a reliable resource here? Because our goal was to build a flexible resource that can help address some of those needs and work with other lines of business. So we spent a lot of time really figuring out how long can we rely on this resource, how often, and how much can we really count on it. And so since launching this program just last May, we've enrolled 16,000 customers, but almost more importantly, we've made really good learnings within the company, where we worked with different lines of business to overcome the silos, I think that Scott mentioned earlier, and brought the customer really closer to operations as well as to planning, and see how we can together optimize efficiency, again, without boiling the ocean, using a small project to gain a lot of insights and learnings.
And Andrea, what I would say is pretty astute. One aspect of it that is, there's multiple really good points there. But the idea that you're already looking ahead and thinking about multiple stakeholders and how this will work over time. You're absolutely right. You don't need to solve all that now, but you're having those discussions, you're thinking about it. And as we scale these kinds of opportunities and we say, okay, if we're going to start operating the grid differently, we're going to incentivize customers, you're thinking much more with the customer and from their perspective, but you're also saying, well, we have a way of historically operating things. And if we're going to do this, we don't own these assets and we really depend on them. Is that something that and all of that is not going to change overnight. And you need the different stakeholders engaged to learn and experience. And I think as you scale it, those are ways that make it way more effective. Instead of you running into a brick wall, you're running into resistance. I think those things are important. There's other aspects, Adam, and part of this relates a little bit to more cloud-based technologies. But I'm going to finish if I remember. It's not really just about a cloud or as a service, but one aspect. So we had a recent project where we're working with our customer delivering something as a service, and we've been thinking more boldly, even when it comes to operations and planning, and not maybe just the customer service side of things, which maybe some utilities have more experience with cloud there. And as we did that, we really realized that we were having conversations with IT staff as part of the broader team that then started getting really into detail about our architecture and how we were going to do these various things. And we sort of, I think, Andrea, for the pilots, I think it comes back, we have to remind each other on these journeys, because I remember I stopped the meeting for a moment and I said, well, we're happy to go into these discussions. First of all, there's a lot of engineers. We all want to go into the detail anyway. But the other aspect was, is that serving the best purpose and the best use of our time? So we'll be as transparent and share, but there's less need for you to have to detail the architecture because you're not going to maintain it. You're not going to stand it up in your data center. And I think, Adam, part of that shift, which was liberating for some of the IT folks there, were, oh, you're absolutely right. That is true. If we have an SLA and you meet your requirements and we can depend on that, that's true. And that meant they could focus more on the business, to your point, like what the business really needs and what's unique about their role in the utility, not maybe more classic IT administrative role. And so I think all those things together, they're just exciting and they're moving the needle.
Mm-hmm. Good stuff. We are getting some questions in from our live audience today, which is great. And just a reminder to the live audience that we're very happy to take your questions. This one, Scott, is directed to you. Let me throw it your way. The audience member said that you talked earlier about how there's a best of breed mindset and a large, perfect, monolithic application mindset. The question is, many IT organizations are currently focused on consolidation. How would you approach this kind of discussion with them?
Yeah, and I think part of this even goes to what Mike was talking about earlier. Part of this is more modern architectures. So I'll briefly say what's been great of our journey and a lot of work we've done with Microsoft over the last 4 years to even think about modernizing and using more cloud solutions as a service is it's completely changed how we develop. And we didn't have here's our cloud team for this function. It's part of the broader R&D, everything that we're doing, whether we deploy things on-premise or in the cloud, we're using the best modern architectures and let's allow things to be more modular. We even as a vendor absolutely are proud of some of the platforming stuff we've done over the years, because we really have brought true platforms and multiple functions that historically in the industry were separate on a common architecture, data model, user interface, and so on. But that also, over time, we've had some applications that became much more, as you said, more monolithic and large, and then more harder to update and upgrade. And so now things become more microservices based, more modular. And so now you can take advantage of enhancements by not having to update and refresh the entire architecture. So that's one thing that our customers are seeing in many of our different offers. Another really important point here is common platform. And so we're working already too, and we've done a lot, but we have a longer term vision about everything that we do software solutions wise for utilities works across a common platform. And what I mean by that is a common data architecture, how we do data services, data processing, how we enable AI and machine learning. And then individual applications across the spectrum become much lighter weight and leverage that kind of architecture. And that can be for third parties. It's not proprietary. It's even in our best interest too, as companies that we invest in or acquire. How do we onboard them? So all those things are huge parts of our investment. And through some of our acquisitions and other things you've seen, hopefully that kind of shows, we're really putting our money where our mouth is, and we know it's important in this industry, because if you just think about choosing every single select best application and then try to manage all those integrations at a utility, that is complex. So there's got to be somewhere in between where you can leverage common architectures, but still bring in novel capabilities versus being this sort of proprietary.
Michael,
Yeah, and if
do
I
you
could
have
just
anything you'd like to add? Go ahead.
yeah, because I think those were all great points that Scott mentioned. And one of the more notable shifts I've seen, at least across the competitive landscape, is, we'll say, a redefining of what best of breed needs to be. You don't have to build everything in-house. I think, frankly, most vendors are shying away from that and moving more towards partner-based approaches. So again, as Scott mentioned, whether you're marketing as a common data fabric, common data layer, almost everyone in the OT space has that core marketing message under that banner of interoperability. If you look at the smart metering space, I think that's an interesting play, where you see Landis and Gear and Itron with their next generation smart meters, which more or less act as a smartphone rather than a Nokia phone with your traditional or first generation smart meters. And rather than building out their own localized analytics applications, they're just building out broad ecosystems of partners, more in the, we'll say, sophisticated analytics space. They'll have them build those, and then they can focus on what they're best at. So I think there's a lot of discussion around that, and one of the more significant changes I've seen in this space over the last 2 years or so.
Michael, let me ask you, direct another audience question to you, and then ask the other panel members to weigh in on this also. And this doesn't, do you see DERMS as being part of ADMS? ADMS as part of DERMS, or something else?
Yeah, it's a good question. And frankly, that question is probably more convoluted than it needs to be. I think you see some stakeholders playing fast and loose with the term DERMS. And I think that leads to some of the confusion. But the way we're segmenting it, or the way we're visiting it, is two primary segments of what we call DERMS. What we label as our grid DERMS. So that's going to be your kind of core ADMS-centric direct tie-in. And that's focused more around the optimization of front of the meter renewables. Right, so a natural tie-in to your ADMS, that I view as part of ADMS. You also see what used to be called demand response management systems, increasingly branded under that DERMS pseudonym. And so we label that as edge DERMS. But more or less, that's an evolution of, again, your legacy DRMS systems that now just have to manage an influx of new types and frankly, far more behind the meter DERs, smart thermostats, electric vehicles. So a progression and an evolution more towards what you'd call your traditional DERMS use cases. But I would still keep that as or more of an IT-centric DERMS classification. So depending on which kind of set of vendors and primary offerings you're looking at, yes and no.
Mm-hmm. Additional comments around that question?
A couple of things I might add to the conversation of IT consolidation is, one would be, whenever you're looking at an upgrade, consider what you can actually shed. We really don't need all of the customizations that we have. Utilities are very much ingrained in a process of, this is the way it's always been. And I think really engage with those business partners which are actually thinking past that to, okay, the more custom technology that we have, the more custom training that we have, the harder it is to bring in employees, both for IT and for the business groups. And it just becomes a real challenge. So think about your upgrade opportunities as a place in which you could actually shed or move out into a cloud. Do you really need a server? Maybe you just need a process that runs out in the cloud somewhere. Another one I would say is also think about vendors. A lot of vendors now are offering SaaS solutions. And so can you move that out? For example, the DERMS might be a good place. Okay, ADMS for PSE had to be an on-prem, but DERMS doesn't have to be, and there's no reason we can't integrate, you know, an off-site DERMS with an on-prem ADMS. And so look at those opportunities to really engage with a vendor who is working in a SaaS solutions, have the vendor even potentially manage that application for you, because your employees, both IT and business, are best used towards solving the future problems, not maintaining systems that's sort of low-hanging fruit. We just don't need to be engaged in that work anymore. So, there.
Yeah, I would just quickly say too, so we had launched Grid to Prosumer DERMS concept a year and a half ago, and our approach is what Michael described and encapsulates that. And I like the way Guidehouse is framing that. But I think in the end, if we all do our jobs best, for us, it was a way to explain that we're thinking about how do you do customer success, customer service, program management, integrate the meter assets, run programs, but also how do you do flexibility and start using assets in different ways, but have a grid context and aware of constraints on the grid, and understanding that these ultimately need to all be coordinated and working. So for us, this drives our investment to do that in a way that can be broader in thinking, but we need to be flexible, especially on the stepwise journey approach, to say, what are the different starting points utility might have? What are they working on now? But again, with that vision of how this will be integrated and coordinated over time. I think one aspect on grid awareness, and you talked about, asked the question was more about DERMS as a part of ADMS and those things. If in Michael's terminology, so if you're looking at grid DERMS, that absolutely could be a function that's within an ADMS. But I think what we're seeing a lot is there's a journey for an ADMS system that does many things and is integrated across many systems. And is the control center ready for the responsibility of DER management? And how do you get there? And there's ways to deploy systems that are grid DERMS that are integrating with an ADMS, but can be much more agile, could be in the cloud, could be run by different teams. And so I guess it really comes back to the architectures that we have and the challenge that we're trying to solve. We're trying to reduce the friction by enabling different ways you can do these things. And ultimately, you're looking really at a set of capabilities and unlocking those capabilities, whatever you call the platform.
Let's talk. I'd like all of you to kind of weigh in on this next topic, and that is how do you go about building the case internally for a stepwise approach? We heard earlier that there was discussion about this is the way that we've always done it, and there are these cultural issues and whether or not there's a culture of innovation and risk taking. And I'm wondering how this kind of approach perhaps necessitates a different kind of conversation, and how you go about building internal support for a more stepwise approach that perhaps is more research oriented or is proof of concept oriented. What do those conversations look like? How should people think about structuring those kinds of conversations? Scott, do you want to start, and then bring in everyone else?
Yeah, I'd really also like to hear from the others on this too. I would say that the way that we see has been most successful is to have a collaboration at different levels within an organization. Definitely having leadership that sponsors and supportive of this is really key. And having a way to say, let's start small, let's have a clear goal, and how might we do it? I think also, maybe you don't have to have the system 100% robust or architected from an IT perspective in a way that it ultimately will need to be down the road. And I think if you can be open-minded to say, well, we can be more simple in this way. Let's not overcomplicate this. Let's try here. And if you just have those conversations and everyone checks themselves to say, well, do we really need that right now? And maybe you do, and maybe that's a priority. But you're right. Maybe we're just used to doing it this way. I think those kinds of things stimulate a lot of this discussion in the right direction.
Andre, do you want to take a
Yeah, just to build on that, I think a lot of the things that we're talking about are so new too, and they come with a lot of uncertainty. And when we think about the people that we work with, for all of us, this is new and can be sometimes a little bit scary too. So I think approaching it with this mindset and saying, look, this sounds exciting, but we really don't know exactly how it's going to work out. So let's just try it, and let's document very clearly what we want to do, and kind of take the fear of failing away, and really approach it more with the mindset of like, let's test it. If it works, fantastic. If not, great. We learned something and we can move on. So I think we need to, as utilities, we're very risk averse. So we almost have to create a separate environment where it's okay to not be 100% successful all the time. We can take a bit more risk, but I think we have to be really honest about it, and bring other people along to make sure that it's successful.
I'm wondering, Andrea, just hearing you say that, I want to go back to what Michael said before, and he brought up the idea of de-risking, reducing risk by starting smaller and being more stepwise. And so maybe there's a way to correlate those two, that you're taking some risk here, but it is smaller. And in the end, you're going to learn faster and make better decisions over time before you make a bigger decision here without information that is much more risky. It's an interesting thought.
We are doing one project right now, and Michael, you mentioned the grid edge capabilities of new AMI earlier. So that's exactly the approach that we're taking. We are building a separate lab where we're testing these distributed intelligence applications in a test environment, so not in a production environment. And it's a very different mindset with which we approach this environment. And the plan is to only roll it out to the broader meter base once we know, once we will feel confident that these apps work, that we actually know what to do with them and how to include it into our business as usual. So the idea is that by testing it in a small environment, we can actually leapfrog some of the typical testing stages and be much safer in the end, and also faster when it comes to ultimate deployment.
Interesting approach. Interesting. Adam, what can you add?
Yeah, I think you know, there is a reality to the fact that some projects are very big, and the trick there would be also to not necessarily try and figure out everything that you're going to do along the entire journey, as Andrea was saying. Break it out into smaller areas where you can actually deliver a minimum viable product. If you could bring up the second slide that I'd sent over. We were looking at our GIS transformation, and I'm not going to speak to all of the details here, but we have multiple GIS systems, and we're trying to consolidate that technology down to one item, but we don't necessarily understand the full journey. And trying to do a waterfall project in which we rip out the GIS, replace it with something else, was monstrous, absolutely monstrous. And so break it out into smaller areas, build out the infrastructure, which is that top orange one, create this data synchronization from our current GIS to the new GIS, because that gives you then a foundation on which, okay, now we can do data analytics. We can build out a data lake, which is spatially oriented based on that new data synchronization that we've got. We can change our downstream processes, like replacing our field solution, looking at our downstream interfaces into ADMS, into Synergy, retiring the old system, looking at printed maps and how might we go about just doing that in a digital way. But all of those downstream things can now be built out of that initial data synchronization that's on the new platform. So on up to this point, we haven't done anything about replacing the original tool. What we're doing is enabling a platform for the future for the rest of the organization. And then as we get to understand what does it mean to be on this new platform, at the end of it, the purple sections, we can take on that role of, okay, now the upstream things where we're looking at material tracking and traceability coming into the system, design data coming into the system, and the drafting and editing within the system itself. All of that kind of goes in at the later end of it. And if at any point that we wanted to stop this, we could say, okay, we can stop at any point in time and we still delivered something of value. Even if we stop at the data synchronization, we can still say we now have a platform on which you can do business analytics. So it had its value, and you're breaking it out into much, much smaller chunks, delivering a minimum viable product along the way and changing your journey as you go through it, not trying to define a 5-year project up front, which just wouldn't have worked for us. So that's an approach that we've taken on a minimum viable product.
Yeah, I want to just on a couple points there, because I think data quality is an interesting topic as it pertains to some of these larger or more complex investments. I think there used to be a mindset that, yeah, we're not going to deploy this ADMS or GIS system because our data quality just isn't there. Well, you can still get efficiencies, and again, by employing a more stepwise approach, you can usually deploy baseline functionalities that actually show you where your data gaps are and identify some of those data quality issues. So you can improve upon your data quality while, again, I'm employing a stepwise approach that minimizes some of those risks and still provides value, in the near term.
Mm-hmm.
There's been another question from the audience, and just to bring kind of another dynamic to this, the question is, how important are regulatory reforms and or changes in allowing innovation solutions to land effectively? Talk maybe a little bit about the regulatory aspects of some of these things. Scott, do you want to start with that and maybe throw out a couple of ideas?
Very important. It's something that Schneider Electric has really been more and more in over the last recent years. And I think, and how do we work with our customers to help them with that landscape? It's interesting too, because if you have province by province or state by state approaches with utility commissions and energy boards, how do you manage that and navigate? We have national policies in the U.S. for sure. And one aspect that I've found is look at all the drivers, look at the change and the aspirations that we have as society and energy transition, sustainability, and these things. And it's a really ripe opportunity to propose a different approach that hits those goals. Because any regulators will be much more motivated to try to prove things out and make momentum if it's really hitting the key targets that they have with their constituents and so on. So I think that's key. I think that, Andrea, I was actually going to ask you about the Ontario Energy Board, because I think in some cases, they're even becoming a little bit more open to saying, here's our direction, not here's exactly what we're mandating to happen, but here's our direction. Start thinking about how you could do it and how that maybe unleashes more innovation even from a utility like Hydro One.
Yeah, definitely. We see some not full regulatory reform by any stretch, but we definitely see some openness and some changes. So there's clear direction, as I mentioned earlier, to integrate more DERs, to not just connect them, but to find a way to enable them to serve a grid purpose on all levels, ideally. There's more openness to experimenting. So we have certain sandbox, innovation sandbox initiatives where utilities can take a smaller amount of money and really trial certain things, and share the results with other utilities to see if what the learnings are and if it is an efficient or effective way of addressing a problem. So there's definitely more openness to trying certain things. I think we need more of that because we are still a little bit stuck in this idea that utilities, especially regulated utilities, are compensated for investing capital, and a lot of the newer cloud solutions, for example, don't qualify as capital. So that's where I think we're often a little bit hung up and maybe held back from innovation. So there is still a lot of work, a lot of room for improvement, but we are definitely seeing the right signals here in Ontario.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say, just on the cloud point, I see that as the primary barrier to cloud innovation and greater adoption. If you look at the financial services industry, the healthcare, insurance, all near ubiquitous use of cloud and SaaS platforms. And I think the conversation, 5 years ago was around cybersecurity. But if you look at any industry test, that has largely been framed as now perceived rather than actual problems when it comes to security. And so, yeah, it's the inability to capitalize on those OpEx expenses. And you've seen some utilities in the States use, say, creative workarounds. Alabama Power comes to mind. Some utilities in New York come to mind. there are 4 or 5 different ways in which U.S. utilities have approached their PUCs or PSCs, and we're allowed to at least capitalize on a portion of those OpEx expenses. So it's moving in the right direction, but like with most things in the utility space, slow moving.
Adam, do you have any insights you'd like to share as well?
Not specifically in that area. One of the things which sort of jumped to my mind, though, as we were talking about the regulatory changes and our business groups and this adoption, was also around the perspective of business management of these things. So what I'm really thinking here is we are taking on projects where it challenges the organizational structures that we have and trying to adopt to those. Yes, we have these regulatory requirements. We've also got internal expectations. So for example, the virtual power plant we have started out with just a few megawatts, and okay, that's background noise to a lot of things. The intention was understand what it's capable of. But now we're looking towards, okay, we're up to 30, 40, 50 megawatts. By the time we get to hundreds of megawatts, now we've got transmission scale events occurring on a distribution network, and that has regulatory impacts as well. And so we're really challenging not just our internal structures as who manages a virtual power plant of that scale, but also how do we report that back out to our regulatory group? How does that affect balancing authorities and things like that? There are a lot of challenges here. I don't have the answers.
Yeah, maybe I'll just mention a couple more that came to mind that I think are interesting, more on the positive side of the coin. But when you look in the US, the rise of performance-based rate making, I think it's what, 13, 15 states now where those PUC approvals are being more tied to whether it be energy affordability, customer satisfaction, and even in those non-performance-based or more traditional rate case or traditional markets, a lot of regulators, regardless, are tying PUC approvals to CSAT scores and JD Power. So that's a positive trend that I've seen. Again, not ubiquitous, but on a state-by-state basis is moving in the right direction.
That seems that an underlying point is that IT is no longer a secondary consideration, that when you're looking at the transition that's underway, you need to build these systems in order to support what's coming along. Scott, I wonder if you could address that in a little bit more detail. The kind of the rise of IT is something that really is front and center in the discussions of the transition that's taking place.
We see it everywhere. We've seen it with so much cloud compute, the rise of data centers and energy required to feed. I mean, more and more data, crunching of data, artificial intelligence. There's so many aspects that are already doing it. Maybe a positive aspect of that is that as we've done more and more through data centers and management of data centers and doing them more efficiently, but also understanding how do you host these kind of complex, large-scale systems with high reliability, lots of traffic, and that helps across many industries. And I think there's so many things that utilities can leverage and learn. They can't keep up run their own data. And what's out there that's got experts in that space that you can. I think that's huge. I mean, aspects of procuring cloud and regulations around that. You're absolutely right, Mike. We've worked to have some different ways of navigating that for today, today and moving forward and getting certain things approved, even if they're by exception. But I do see that traction happening. And I'll even go back to when in the U.S., when the administration, almost 3 years ago now, had a cybersecurity executive order. One of the major takeaways was across everything federal, we need more modern software, more cloud. And when the federal government is saying that, realizing that's a more cyber secure way to go, utilities listen. And so there's a lot of these things that are moving the needle and that are positive and a work in progress. But yeah, you're right. I expect David are huge.
And when we think about sorry,
no, go ahead.
Now, and when we think about really operating this modern grid and bringing customers and the grid together, especially new like renewables, DERs, and so on. We are creating such a much more complex world where data is everything, and we need to really leverage this data and analyze it better to make sure that we can operate it. Because all of a sudden we have all this multi-directional flow of data, and we need way more real-time insights on the grid side, as well as on what we anticipate customers are doing to make sure that we create this efficient grid that really meets everyone's needs and achieves those our net zero goals, as well as integrates all of the different resources that we have.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, just on kind of your note around IT being a secondary consideration, I might reframe that, just because if you look at generation transmission networks, almost every utility has an EMS. They've been involved in kind of IT operations. It's now that there's an increased demand for that in the distribution network. So I think that's the major evolution, is, as Andrea mentioned, the increase in complexity is demanding that utilities finally have that last mile of visibility, where they traditionally have not, and to a large extent still don't.
And I would also add there are significant challenges around trying to provide the infrastructure that we need to our business groups. There's a lot of questions these days around artificial intelligence and how we can make those sorts of things available. And security is a big aspect of that, but it's not the only aspect. The tool sets themselves, we have a variety of people, and you really have to try and target, if you're going to build out a data lake of any sort or a tool set for doing big analytics, is who are your sort of high-tech people? How do you provide the tools to them? Where does that medium group of maybe business analysts who are savvy around the data, but not necessarily around the technology of that? And then your low-tech folks who are really just trying to struggle with their day-to-day work, but are definitely affected by, what does it look like when this weather pattern comes in? I don't necessarily understand that. And so you've got to provide tool sets which really scale across the organizations. IT can often be historically an area where we develop to our own needs, not necessarily to the business needs. And again, I would say we have to be able to walk in the shoes of our business partners and really understand what it is that they need. So a long journey, and the one I presented on that GIS transformation was a process of a year's conversation with our business group, really in terms of what do they need, how is their development and cycle going to change. The same sort of thing is happening around artificial intelligence. Everybody wants it. How do we present it to the business groups that need it in the way that they need it?
Well, and one thing too, Adam, we didn't really talk about, but I referenced cloud solutions and technologies quite a bit, but the idea of more at edge and edge compute and hybrid cloud and edge, and there's more intelligence that is local, and if we can leverage more of that, especially customer-sided assets, then and you mentioned also, Michael, smart meters and new things that, for example, that Itron is doing, and those aspects, then that partnership and that collaboration really says what could be done local, what intelligence could be done, what information can I get there, what doesn't all have to be sent to the cloud. And I think this is more where sort of the next frontier is. I perceive.
It's all very much almost a three-dimensional chess game, if you will. There are so many new and very dynamic elements involved with the broad push to electrification, with all of the policy initiatives that are underway, with the rise of distributed energy resources and virtual power plants and all that sort of thing. I wonder, Scott, maybe if you could wrap things up for us and offer the major takeaways that you think are important to convey to our audience this afternoon from what the discussion has been. What's most important to you to convey?
Yeah, I would say maybe less of a recap and more just ending with a focus on collaboration and partnering and how to think about that differently. And I think the more that we are able to do that, it's a pulling thing too. So we're embarking on partnerships where maybe in days of old, we'd say, well, there's areas that we compete, therefore it's not really going to work out so much. I mean, that's really not a sustainable or viable or even a best approach to the industry. And so how do you look at where you can maximize the value of collaboration? And there's so much you can have. And if there's areas that you compete, well, then let that be, and that's fine. And I think also with our utility customers, there's different ways to interact, different ways that they can procure technology and deploy it. And if you are doing agile and incremental, then you're inherently collaborating on making the decision to go. And I find that the culture of that, which is also related to innovation culture, it's just it's better spirited, it's more collaborative. You're feeding off the positive energy of both sides. So I think all those things are important. There's quite a list of great things when we think about partnering, but I would say just step back and say there's different ways to do it, and I think technology partners are putting themselves in a better position. But it's good questions to ask, because you can't just say, yeah, I want to be a good partner. I mean, it takes investment, and it takes how do you do that as a first-class citizen? How do you staff that appropriately? And I think those things are changing, and I think it also forces all of us to not just sell a solution or deliver a product. It really comes down to being a little more consultative. We're not a consulting firm. We're not going, but we have to better guide. We have experiences. How do we better bring that to the table? And those are things that we're working on to do better.
Very good. Well, thank you, panel. This has been a fascinating discussion today. I appreciate all of your insights and all of your time. PJ, I will hand it back over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, panel. Fantastic conversation today. And a special thanks again to our sponsor, Schneider Electric, for making today's event possible. For our audience, look for an email from us containing a link to the replay, and take a moment, please, to complete our survey at the end of the session. Your feedback is greatly appreciated, and we will use it for future sessions. From everyone here at Energy Central, thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you on an upcoming Power Session. Thank you for attending. This does conclude today's presentation.